There's a small, exclusive club of American World War II generals who got relieved of combat command for real, documented reasons, and then somehow talked their way back into leading another entire division into battle anyway. Terry de la Mesa Allen isn't just a member of that club. He's basically the only reason anyone remembers it exists at all. This is a man his own war correspondents called one of the finest tactical generals in the entire United States Army, whose troops adored him enough to drop his rank entirely and just call him by his first name, and whose fellow generals often couldn't stand him, sometimes for reasons that, on close examination, reflected considerably worse on them than on Allen himself. Everything that follows is drawn from official Army Division histories, the HistoryNet archive, Wikipedia's sourced biography, and multiple corroborating military records. Terry de la Mesa Allen was born April 1, 1888, at Fort Douglas, Utah, into about as thoroughly military a family as America could produce. His father, Colonel Samuel Allen, served 43 years in the Army. His maternal grandfather, Colonel Carlos Alvarez de la Mesa, was a Spanish-born officer who'd fought for the Union at Gettysburg with the so-called Garibaldi Guard, a unit of the 39th New York Volunteers, made up largely of foreign-born recruits. Terry grew up bouncing between frontier military posts across the American West, learning to ride a horse almost as early as he learned to walk, spending his boyhood tagging along after his father's own duties, rather than in any conventional schoolroom setting most children his age would have known. At 19, Allen earned an appointment to West Point in 1907. He turned out to be an outstanding horseman and a capable field soldier, and almost nothing else about the institution suited him. In an era when the officer corps still leaned heavily aristocratic and image-conscious, Allen showed up with dirt under his fingernails, a habit of drinking before exams, and a stutter that worsened as he fell increasingly behind academically. He was held back a year after failing mathematics, and eventually failed an ordnance and gunnery course outright, racking up more disciplinary demerits than almost anyone else in his class along the way. Dismissed from the academy in 1911, Allen didn't slink home. He enrolled instead at the Catholic University of America, earned his bachelor's degree in 1912, and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the cavalry that November, just 5 months behind the very West Point class he'd been kicked out of. Allen spent much of the next several years on the U.S.-Mexico border, chasing smugglers, and dealing with the low-grade cross-border skirmishes common to that period, getting his first real taste of combat well before America formally entered the First World War. Off-duty, in the officer corps' more genteel social world, Allen found an unlikely way to earn respect from men who otherwise looked down on his rough manners and casual disregard for spit and polish appearances. Polo. He became captain of his post's team and, by most accounts, a genuinely obsessive tactician about the sport, drilling his teammates against a scoring target only a fraction the width of a regulation goal to sharpen their accuracy far beyond anything their opponents trained for. When his team was set to face a heavily favored regional championship squad expected to crush them, Allen's overtrained players instead won decisively, an early glimpse of the same relentless, unconventional preparation that would define his approach to actual combat command decades later. When America entered World War I, Allen's cavalry unit stayed put on the border, while the actual fighting happened in France, a frustrating position for an officer who'd already spent years angling for real combat experience. Determined to get overseas by any means available, Allen initially deployed with a supply unit, the 315th Ammunition Train. Decent, necessary work, but nowhere near the infantry combat he actually wanted. He maneuvered his way into an infantry commission instead, and by mid-1918 found himself in France, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 358th Infantry Regiment, 90th Division, at the relatively young age of 30. A rapid rise driven almost entirely by his own persistence in a war desperate enough for experienced officers to overlook an unconventional path into the infantry. Allen fought through the Sam Mehil offensive and the massive Meuse-Argonne campaign that followed, the largest single American military operation of the entire war, and was wounded twice in the fighting. Popular legend around Allen has long claimed that one of those wounds, a bullet to the face, somehow cured his stutter outright, a story repeated often enough in retellings of his life that it's become part of his standard biography, though I haven't found it independently confirmed in the more rigorous sourced accounts of his service, so I'll flag it as popular legend rather than settled fact. What is well documented is that Allen developed a genuine appetite for unconventional tactics during this stretch of the war, particularly night attacks, at a time when trench warfare doctrine on both sides overwhelmingly favored daylight assaults, regardless of the cost in casualties. After the armistice, Allen stayed on with occupation forces in Europe until 1922, reportedly striking up a friendly acquaintance with a fellow polo player who turned out to be the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII of Great Britain, entirely unaware of exactly who he'd been drinking and playing sports with until well after the fact. Allen spent the interwar decades back on cavalry duty along the Mexican border, helping rewrite the Army's own cavalry field regulations at Fort Riley, Kansas, and publishing a manual on reconnaissance tactics in the early 1930s. Genuine, substantive doctrinal work at a time when most of the Army still assumed horse cavalry would remain relevant for years to come, even as the earliest crude tanks of the First World War hinted, to anyone paying close attention, at where warfare was actually headed next. Allen also served as assistant division commander in 3 separate divisions during this stretch, reportedly convincing each unit in turn that it was the finest outfit in the entire Army, regardless of what the official record actually said about its performance, an early sign of exactly the kind of morale-building leadership that would later define his combat career. In 1928, while stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, he married Mary Frances Robinson, daughter of El Paso's former mayor, a connection that would eventually shape where Allen chose to spend his retirement decades later. The following year, the couple had their only child, a son named Terry de la Mesa Allen Jr., who would go on to follow his father into the Army and, eventually, into West Point himself, graduating with the class of 1952. Promoted to Brigadier General in 1940 and Major General in 1942, Allen was given command of the 1st Infantry Division, the storied Big Red One, that June, at Fort Benning, Georgia. His assistant division commander turned out to be cut from remarkably similar cloth, Brigadier General Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, a man just as allergic to spit and polish formality, and just as devoted to the ordinary soldiers under his command as Allen himself. Together, Allen and Roosevelt built a command culture almost unheard of at that rank. Men calling their general simply Terry, officers evaluated on competence and initiative rather than uniform inspection, and a division-wide reputation for aggressive, unconventional tactics that started paying off almost immediately once the fighting began in earnest. The 1st Infantry Division landed in Algeria on November 8, 1942, as part of Operation Torch, tasked with capturing the city of Oran, roughly 25 miles inland from the beachhead. Rather than storm a fortified town called St. Cloud that sat directly in his path but held nothing of real strategic value, Allen simply encircled it with a single battalion and pushed the rest of his division on toward the actual objective, avoiding needless casualties on both sides, over a town he had no real need to occupy. Oran fell on schedule, and the tactic, bypassing hardened resistance rather than grinding through it head-on, became something of a signature approach for Allen throughout the rest of the campaign. What followed was months of friction with his own chain of command. Allen believed the 1st Division was being fragmented out piecemeal to support other units, rather than deployed as the cohesive fighting force he'd spent months building. And he said so, repeatedly and loudly, through every level of command available to him, until General Eisenhower himself finally intervened directly on Allen's behalf. In March 1943, ordered to take the Tunisian city of Gafsa at first light the following morning, Allen instead launched a surprise night assault that captured the objective with minimal casualties, hours before his own superiors even expected the attack to begin, a decision that reportedly left General George Patton arriving to observe the dawn assault he'd planned around, both impressed by the result and thoroughly annoyed that Allen hadn't simply followed the timeline as written. By July 1943, the 1st Division spearheaded the amphibious landings at Gela during the invasion of Sicily, one of the most difficult beachheads of the entire campaign. Difficult enough that Patton, despite his personal friction with Allen, insisted on having the division for the assault regardless, reportedly telling Eisenhower plainly that he wanted those sons of bitches and wouldn't go into Sicily without them. The landing force faced a major armored counterattack from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division that second day, involving as many as 90 German tanks bearing down directly on Allen's own headquarters. With no tanks of his own available to counter them, Allen ordered his infantry to let the German armor roll straight over their dug-in positions, then turn and deal with the German infantry following behind on foot, while his own artillery and naval gunfire off the coast concentrated entirely on destroying the tanks themselves. The gambit worked, and by nightfall Allen's exhausted, badly stretched division launched a further counterattack that caught the Germans preparing an offensive of their own for the following morning, wiping it out before it could begin. The campaign's brutal final act came at the mountain town of Troina, part of the Germans' fortified Etna defensive line, described by observers as terrain rugged enough to tax a mountain goat. Allen's division took the town after 6 grinding days of fighting, repelling roughly 24 separate German counterattacks along the way, through a combination of maneuver, deception, and relentless pressure that consistently forced German commanders to react to Allen's moves rather than the reverse. 2 visiting American generals watched the entire performance play out as observers on the ground. Shortly after Troina fell, both Allen and Roosevelt were relieved of their commands. The official justification cited a failed initial assault on the town, one that had actually been carried out by an entirely different regiment, temporarily attached from the 9th Infantry Division, days before Allen's own troops even arrived on the scene. The real friction, most historians agree, was Allen's consistently unorthodox, informal command style, which General Omar Bradley considered fundamentally undisciplined, regardless of how effective it plainly was on the battlefield, complaining specifically that the entire division had come to share Allen's own cavalier attitude toward proper military bearing. 2 days after Allen's relief, Time magazine put him on its cover, praising him as one of the finest division commanders the Army had, timing that made the Army's own internal justification for firing him look considerably less convincing to the American public reading about it. For most American generals relieved of combat command in World War II, that was effectively the end of the story. A quiet stateside training assignment for the remainder of the war, and nothing more, regardless of the circumstances behind the firing. Allen defied that pattern entirely. After a brief rest back in the United States, he received a letter from Eisenhower expressing confidence that Allen's talents would soon be needed elsewhere, rather than simply written off. On October 15, 1943, barely 2 months after being declared unfit for command, Allen took over the 104th Infantry Division at its training camp in Bend, Oregon, a unit that had been organizing since September 1942 under a different commander, and that Allen would spend the better part of the following year reshaping in his own image. Allen spent almost a year building the Timberwolves, as the division became known, into a unit specialized specifically in night combat operations, running them through maneuvers in Oregon, the California-Arizona desert, and specialized night fighting training at Camp Carson, Colorado, over the first half of 1944. The division shipped out for Europe in late August 1944, landing at Cherbourg, France, that September, and was deliberately attached to British and Canadian forces rather than American units. Likely, by more than one historian's estimation, a quiet effort to keep Allen at arm's length from the American commanders who'd relieved him the year before, whether or not that was ever stated as official policy. The Timberwolves fought through northern France, into the Netherlands, and across the Roer and Rhine into Germany, earning a reputation among British and Canadian troops fighting alongside them that Allen had never quite managed to earn from his own countrymen. Canadian Lieutenant General Guy Simonds praised their aggression directly, noting that once the Timberwolves got their teeth into the German lines, they showed real dash and determination. British Field Marshal Harold Alexander reportedly called Allen the finest division commander he'd encountered across two separate world wars, a striking endorsement given the often prickly, competitive relationship between British and American commanders throughout the entire war. The division became known simply as the night fighters among the Allied troops fighting beside them. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Timberwolves held their sector firmly on the northern flank of the German offensive, while other American units struggled badly further south. The division went on to help capture the industrial city of Stolberg, and later took part in sealing off the Ruhr Pocket, trapping roughly 300,000 German soldiers and forcing their eventual mass surrender. Not every part of the campaign was triumphant. Shortly after landing in France, Allen's first stop was the grave of his old friend and former assistant commander, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who had insisted on personally leading the only wave of general officers to land directly with the first assault troops on D-Day at Utah Beach, and who died of a heart attack just weeks later, before ever seeing the rest of the campaign through. Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, a recognition Allen had reportedly pushed hard for on his old friend's behalf, even while commanding an entirely different division hundreds of miles away. The 104th Division was deactivated in 1945, and Allen retired from the Army the following year after 34 years of total service, settling in his wife's hometown of El Paso, Texas, where he worked as a representative for various insurance companies and remained active in veterans organizations and civic affairs for the rest of his life, a considerably quieter existence than the one he'd spent decades building on battlefields across two world wars. Tragedy found the family once more in October 1967, when Allen's only son, by then a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion in his father's old 1st Infantry Division, was ambushed and killed near Lai Khe, South Vietnam, at the age of 38, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. Then Terry de la Mesa Allen died less than 2 years later, on September 12, 1969, at the age of 81, following a short illness at a military hospital in El Paso. He's buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery, beside the son he outlived by less than 2 years, a general who got fired for caring too much about the men beneath him, who came back anyway, and who spent the rest of his career and the rest of his life afterward, never once regretting the men he'd chosen to put first. Across 2 world wars, Allen was ultimately awarded 2 Army Distinguished Service Medals, a Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and decorations from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union besides, a formal record of honors that, characteristically, mattered to him considerably less than the loyalty of the ordinary soldiers who'd fought under him and simply called him Terry.